Evio.
Welcome back to the Ides of April. This is part 2 of our story called The Keys of Blood, the assassination of Pope John VIII. We pick up this week with chapter 4, The Hammer and the Veil. By the late 870s, Rome had become a ghost that refused to lie down. The city still stood, it still prayed, it still traded in the currency of relics and memory, but its soul had grown brittle. Every wall bore the weight of an older one that had already begun to crumble. The basilicas were dim with smoke, their altars stripped of gold to pay soldiers and to silence creditors. The great marble statues that once guarded the forum stood now as pale, decapitated witnesses to decline. Even the air felt exhausted, as if centuries of incense had soaked into the lungs of the living and made them heavy with history. In that world, Pope John VIII reigned less as a sovereign than as a survivor. He'd outlasted emperors, he'd outlasted pirates and kings, he'd watched his allies die of poison and his enemies die of age. And through it all, he continued to write, to anyone who would listen, and to many more who would not. His papacy, once filled with the hope of Christian renewal, had narrowed to a single stubborn task: keep the light on in Rome, however faintly it flickered. But even the faintest of flames draw moths, and within the city walls, the great families of Rome had grown bold. The Crescenses, the Spoletans, the Theophylax, and the Tuscans all claimed a piece of the city's authority. Now, I know last week I mispronounced Theophylax by saying Theophylax. Thanks for the comments. My bad. But these families, they controlled bridges and gates, they collected taxes that should have gone to the church, and they maintained private militias whose loyalty shifted by the season. Their quarrels turned Rome into a chessboard, and the Pope, God's vicar, was merely one piece among many. Now John could see the trap tightening, though he refused to name it. He began to withdraw from public view, conducting more of his business through letters and emissaries. The Lateran palace became a fortress of paper and silence. Even his most loyal clerics complained that the pontiff had grown suspicious and remote. When visitors were permitted to see him, they found an old man in a darkened chamber, surrounded by scrolls. His once vibrant eyes dulled to the gray of candle smoke. He slept little, he ate even less, and he prayed with the desperation of a man who knew that his prayers were no longer being heard. And yet, beneath that frailty, there remained a hard, defiant spark. The chronicles speak of nights when the Pope would rise from his chair and pace the length of the Lateran corridor, muttering to himself in Latin. A chant, maybe, or a litany, maybe an argument with the God he served. The guards on duty swore they could hear him speaking of hammers of light, of the blood of Peter that had soaked into the very stones of the Vatican. Whether this was madness or revelation, no one could really say. But it was during one such night, they claim, that John entered the private chapel of St. Leo and stood before an ancient relic, a small iron hammer said to have been used in the forging of the nails that bound Christ to the cross. The hammer was blackened with age, its head pitted and worn smooth from centuries of reverent touch. John lifted it from its velvet cushion and turned it in his hands. He was an old man. His grip was unsteady. Yet something in the weight of that relic, it seemed to steady him. "This," he said to have whispered, This is the measure of faith. Creation and destruction are brothers. The story's probably apocryphal. It rings of invention. Maybe it was embroidered by later chroniclers eager to give symbolism to tragedy. But history, when it nears a turning point, it often acquires a rhythm too poetic to merely be coincidence. In the months that followed, the Pope's world began to shrink even further. Saracen raiders continued to harass the southern provinces, while in the north, the Franks tore each other apart. Trade faltered, famine crept through the countryside, and disease followed. The treasury was empty again, and the guards at the gate hadn't been paid in weeks. Rome itself seemed to hold her breath. Then, in the winter of 881, something shifted. The Saracen threat, though still present, began to fade just a little. The invaders turned their attention eastward, toward the riches of Byzantium. For the first time in years, the bells of St. John Lateran rang not in mourning, but actually in thanksgiving. John ordered public prayers of gratitude, and for a brief season, the city was able to exhale. But peace, when it came, it felt wrong, felt too sudden, too quiet. And the Pope's advisors warned him that calm was often the only sound before collapse. He dismissed them, though he couldn't dismiss the unease that crept into his own dreams. There were rumors of meetings held by torchlight in the homes of the noble families. Strange alliances were forming between men who'd been enemies for generations. Even the clergy had begun to choose sides. Rome, which had endured barbarians and emperors, was now being eaten alive from within. Later that year, John fell sick. Some said it was poison, others said it was exhaustion. Now, he recovered, but barely, and his illness left him frail enough that the nobles began to circle the wolves. They accused him of mismanaging the treasury, of favoring foreign mercenaries, of surrendering the church's dignity to foreign kings. Now look, every accusation was half true, but that was enough. A delegation of Roman lords appeared at the Lateran, demanding that the Pope abdicate. John refused. He'd survived too much. He had sacrificed too much to die in anything less than his full vestments. He told them that the keys of Peter could be handed over only by God himself. And from that day on, his death became inevitable. The chroniclers, they don't agree on what happened next. Some say the conspirators met in the basilica itself, beneath the shadow of the apse mosaic, and swore an oath to free Rome from tyranny. Others insist the plot was smaller, born of exhaustion and greed. What is known is that on a cold December evening in the year 882, torches were seen moving along the corridors of the Lateran Palace long after the guards had changed watch. The following morning, the doors to the papal chamber were found locked from within. When they were broken open, Pope John VIII lay dead upon the floor, his skull crushed by a hammer, and his throat cut, just to be sure. The relic, the ancient iron hammer from the chapel of St. Leo, was never found. Rome buried him quietly, with none of the pomp that usually attended the death of a pontiff. There were no processions, no hymns, no tolling of bells. It was as if the city, ashamed of what it had done, had conspired to forget. The Vatican records would later state, with chilling brevity, "Occasus est in Palatio Lateranense." He was killed in the Lateran Palace. The veil of holiness that had once cloaked the papacy was gone. In its place remained only power, naked and unrepentant. And in that moment, when faith gave way to fear, when relics became weapons, the church entered its long, dark sleep. Chapter 5, The Assassination. The night Pope John VIII was murdered began like any other, if such a phrase can still apply to a man who lived in constant fear of being killed. It was the winter of 882, bitterly cold, even for Rome. The wind that swept through the streets carried dust from the ruins of the Forum and the sour smell of smoke from hearths burning olive wood and lumber. The city had learned to burn its own past to stay warm. Inside the Lateran palace, the guards stood close to their torches, the light flickering off their armor. Beyond the walls, the city was quiet, unnaturally so. Even the dogs seemed to sense what the human heart refused to name. Now, John hadn't slept in days. He had taken to working by lamplight, his chamber cluttered with scattered parchment, half-written letters, and the remains of unfinished meals. The Pope's handwriting, once elegant and flowing, had grown tight and angular, as if every word cost him a little bit more of his life. Those who served him said that he prayed constantly, but not out loud. Instead, he would sit in silence for hours, staring into the flame of a single candle, lips moving faintly as if in argument. There were times when he looked not like the vicar of Christ, but like a man bargaining with ghosts. In the city below, the conspirators had already begun to move. How many there were and who among them struck the final blow will never be known. The chronicles of the time are fragmentary, obscured by politics and fear. One monk, writing years later, claimed that a group of Roman nobles led the plot, resentful of the Pope's taxation and his refusal to share power. Another source suggests his own guards were bribed, the crime carried out not in rebellion, but in routine betrayal. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Those who came for John knew precisely when to strike and where to find him. Shortly after midnight, a torch was seen gliding along the northern corridor of the palace, the wing reserved for the papal apartments. The guards on duty swore afterward that they saw nothing, that they heard nothing, that they were changing the guard post, or they were praying, or that they just weren't in that area. Fear makes liars of honest men. But inside, the old Pope sat writing by lamplight. His final letter, discovered later beneath a stack of parchment, was addressed not to a king or a bishop, but to God himself. It begins with the words, "If I have failed you, let me not fail in death." Then the page breaks off mid-sentence, the ink smeared as if by a sudden motion. Maybe that's when he heard them, the footsteps, the whisper of steel, the faint shift of shadow in the doorway. The men who entered carried no banner, no decree. There was no proclamation, there was no trial. Only a silence so deep it must have roared in his ears. They struck first with the hammer, the weapon chosen not for symbolism, but for certainty. The skull gives less resistance than stone. It said that he didn't cry out, that the only sound was the shattering of the lamp and the rush of spilled oil igniting on the floor. The room filled with smoke. The blow to the throat followed, a slit to ensure the silence was permanent. And then, like all violence born of fear, it ended as quickly as it began. When morning came, the sun rose pale and indifferent over the Tiber. The city stirred to its routines. In the Lateran, servants discovered the body. The details recorded by the scribes are restrained, almost bureaucratic in their horror. Occusus est in Palatio Lateranensi. He was killed in the Lateran palace, nothing more. No elaboration, no epitaph, no gesture of grief. Rome, that ancient stage of tragedy and spectacle, turned its face away. The body was cleaned, wrapped, and buried in haste. No procession wound through the streets, no incense burned, no bells tolled, only the sound of the wind moving through the colonnades of St. John Lateran. A whisper that some said carried his final prayer. The official story declared that Pope John VIII had died peacefully in his sleep, quote, called home by the Lord after years of faithful service. It was a lie so thin it became a confession. The priests who prepared his body saw the wound, the dark caving of the skull, the neat slice across the throat. They didn't say anything. They understood that even the truth had become politics now. For months, Rome pretended. Then the cardinals gathered, and an election was held, and a new pope was installed. This time, a man of compromise, carefully chosen to offend no one and to change nothing. The documents of the new pontiff's reign begin not with mourning, but with taxation records and land disputes, as though holiness were a business that couldn't afford to close for bereavement. But Rome remembers in whispers what it forgets in words. By spring, stories had begun to circulate. Some claimed the hammer used in the murder had been the relic from St. Leo's chapel, the same one John had prayed over in his final months. Others said it had been stolen and replaced with an ordinary weapon, that the real relic had vanished into the hands of the conspirators, passing from one noble family to another for generations. A darker version of the tale insisted that the hammer had been thrown into the Tiber, cursed, to prevent it from ever being used again. But all versions agreed on one thing, that the weapon was heavy with meaning, and the meaning was fear. What the world didn't yet realize, and what it couldn't realize, was that this wasn't merely a murder. This was an ending. The first time a pope was killed by his own court, the church ceased to be a kingdom apart. It became like every other power on earth at that time, vulnerable to ambition, jealousy, and decay. In killing John VIII, the assassins had done more than remove a man. They had stripped the papacy of its illusion of sanctity. After that night, no pope would ever sleep entirely without fear again. For centuries, the church refused to speak about it. Official histories would gloss over the event with euphemism and omission. The murder of a pope by Christians was an obscenity too dangerous to even acknowledge, yet the silence spoke louder than any confession ever could. Every subsequent pontiff who walked the halls of the Lateran would feel it. That weight, that whisper from the stones. The hammer's echo didn't fade. It just changed form. By the time a new century dawned, the papacy had fractured entirely. There would be rival popes. There would be bought popes. Rome would fall into the hands of its own nobility. The blood that had been spilled in that locked room in 882 would become the currency of an age now known to historians as the Dark Century. 100 years in which faith and power were indistinguishable, and God's own house became a battlefield. In later centuries, chroniclers would say that John VIII's death was the first crack in the great wall of divine authority. Through that crack came the light of reform, the light of rebellion, and eventually the light of reason. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, even the slow, modern erosion of faith, all in some strange genealogy of consequence, can trace their descent from that hammer in the dark. The death of a single pope didn't end the church, but it changed its soul forever. The empire had been broken long before John took the throne, but it was his blood, not Charlemagne's crown, that marked the true end of Christendom. And for those who lived in Rome, the lesson was bitterly clear. In the city of God, even God's chosen can be murdered like kings.
If your dog could talk, they'd beg for Ollie. The full-body tail wag, the excited little hops, the big, goofy grin, that's the Ollie effect. Ollie delivers clean, fresh nutrition in 5 drool-worthy flavors, even for the pickiest eaters. Made in U.S. kitchens with highest quality human-grade ingredients, Ollie's food contains no fillers, no preservatives, just real food. And here's the thing. Healthier food means a happier pup, more energy, shinier coats, and more excitement at mealtime. With 5 protein-packed recipes like fresh beef with sweet potatoes or fresh turkey with blueberries, even the pickiest eaters can't resist. You might think my dog eats better than I do, and that's probably true when it comes to Ollie. Get your welcome kit. For any first-timers, Ollie will send out your pup's first box with 2 weeks' worth of meals, a free storage container for mess-free serving, and a guide of how to gradually switch them over to their new diet. Dogs deserve the best, and that means fresh, healthy food. Head to ollie.com/IDES. Tell them all about your dog and use code IDES to get 60% off your welcome kit when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a happiness guarantee on the first box, so if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/IDES and enter IDES to get 60% off your first box. Quick question. Could you list every financial account you have right now? Your 401k, checking, savings, investments, maybe even that old retirement account from a job 10 years ago? Most people can't. And that lack of awareness usually means money is being left on the table. That's where Monarch Money comes in. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that organizes your entire financial life in one clean dashboard on your phone or laptop. In minutes, you can link all your accounts, see where your money is going, and get smart visuals that make the big picture clear. No more juggling apps, no more spreadsheets. Monarch is designed for people with busy lives. It helps you save more, invest smarter, and actually feel in control of your money. That's why it's been named Best Budgeting App of 2025 by the Wall Street Journal, Forbes' Best App for Couples, and even recognized by CNBC as one of the top fintech companies in the world. So stop guessing, stop leaving money on the table, and start feeling confident about your finances. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code IDES at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code IDES.
Chapter 6. The Keys of Blood. In the days after the murder, Rome behaved as wounded cities often do. Closed its eyes and kept walking. The markets opened, the bells were rung for mass, and the benches along the porticos filled with quiet talk. A few men swore they had heard something in the night. Footsteps where none should be, the thud of wood on bone. But the city's always been good at teaching witnesses to forget. The first official notices used the old euphemisms: called to the Lord, fallen asleep in Christ. There was no mention of the lamp shattered on the floor, or the oil burned into the carpet, or the blade that made the silence permanent. Rome stepped carefully over those details and went on with the business of being eternal. But eternity has a way of revealing what time tries to hide. The absence of John VIII wasn't a vacancy. It was a pressure drop, the moment a storm announces itself. Within weeks, factions circulated names like coin. A compromised pope was selected, and then, almost as quickly, unseated by rival interests. The long century that followed would run on a chaotic rhythm. Short pontificates, sudden deaths, elections conducted at spear point. The keys to the kingdom passed like a signet ring among great families who treated the church less as a house of God than as a dowry to be acquired. It's tempting to mark that night in 882 as merely another Roman crime. That would be tidy, but wrong. Something structural failed. The papacy's aura, the belief that God's anointed stood an arm's length above politics, shattered like the lamp glass in John's chamber. After that, no oath was safe from interpretation, no vestment proof against ambition. To say the church, quote, entered darkness, isn't helpful. The truth is more ordinary and more damning. The church became exactly like the world it claimed to redeem. And the evidence wasn't theoretical. In less than a generation, Rome endured the grotesque theater of the cadaver synod, a dead pontiff propped on a throne so that living men could condemn him. A carnival of vengeance, yes, but also a symptom. When you lose the idea of sanctity, you reach for spectacle to replace it. The papal states fractured into fortress fiefdoms. The great houses, Theophylact, Crescenti, Tusculum, took turns dressing their will as piety. Bishops were made in the morning and unmade by nightfall. The word reform appeared in letters with increasing frequency, carrying the same weary hope men attached to rain during a drought. And yet, even in this season of knives, something like providence went on breathing. The church didn't die. It compromised, it sinned, it failed publicly and often, but it also remembered its better self in fragments. In a monastery where books were copied by poor candlelight. In a parish where priests tended the plague-stricken without pay. In a letter written by a frightened deacon who believed that words still mattered. The soul that had been wounded in the Lateran didn't bleed out all at once. The political landscape changed around it, as landscapes do. New kings rose from the wreck of shattered empires. The crown of the so-called Roman emperor migrated north into German hands. A different idea of order took root beyond the Alps. Rome, long accustomed to crowning protectors, found itself petitioning them instead. And it's not an insult to say that the papacy survived by becoming smaller. From that reduction came the seed of something far more durable. A clarity about jurisdiction, a grammar for reform, the stubborn insistence that law should bind even those who claim to speak for heaven. If you try, you can trace a crooked line from the blow that killed John VIII to the Gregorian and Antonian restructurings that followed, to the slow disentangling of lay and clerical power, to the push to regulate appointments and punish simony, to the audacity to tell kings that a priest was not their property. None of this happened cleanly, and none of it happened because of a single act, but blood concentrates the mind. After 882, no pope could pretend that he lived above consequences. That knowledge, terrible, humbling, became the discipline that the institution had lacked. Was there anything in John himself that predicted this strange aftermath? Maybe. He wasn't a reformer in the modern sense, no manifesto, no tidy program, but he possessed a hard, unromantic understanding of the world. He believed that a city can be holy and poor, besieged but still faithful, unworthy and still loved. He paid for peace when he had to. He raised a militia when he had to. He remained at his post when running would have been forgivable. The men who killed him threatened the church with extinction. Instead, they set in motion a great purge. Now, it would take generations and consume reputations, but it would also eventually knit the papacy back into something more disciplined than the court it had been. The rest of Europe learned some other lessons. Princes noticed that Rome could be bent, and so they bent it. They also learned that a terrorized papacy makes a terrible ally. The better rulers, few but real, saw advantage in a church governed by law rather than whim. They discovered that certainty about tithes, about marriage, about inheritance and sanctuary requires a Rome that can say no and have the saying recognized. In this way, the political class became, unwillingly, a midwife to order. They constrained Rome in order to use it, and in constraining it, gave it the very spine their fathers had knocked loose. The faithful, those without banners, those who bury their dead and go back to work, adapted with the quiet genius of survival. They learned not to listen too closely to the feuds of prelates. They kept feast days, not factions. They judged the church by the priest at the rail and the nurse at the bed, rather than by the noble seated behind the altar. If the papacy had become mortal, that mortality made its miracles more believable. Grace, when it appeared, looked like mercy given by men who knew they didn't deserve to be wearing white. We're left with the image that began this story. The keys lifted over a bowed head. In art, they're bright, they're weightless, they're symbolic. In practice, they're heavy things. They're forged from promises, and promises need to be kept in public. The men who hold them know that they're not only signs of heaven's gate, but instruments of earthly risk. John's killers thought the keys could be taken like treasure. They found instead that the keys aren't a possession, they're a burden. And burdens have a way of finding new shoulders. Sometime in the spring after his death, a scribe in a minor Roman church copied a brief memorial into a register otherwise devoted to property leases and baptisms. The note is almost invisible in the ledger's neat columns. It reads, "For our Bishop John, may the Lord remember his endurance." No titles, no miracles, no anathemas, only endurance. And that's the right word. Empires crumble, councils bicker, relics are stolen, lamps go out. Endurance is the miracle mortality permits. History doesn't give us John's last sound. Maybe it was a prayer under his breath. Maybe it was only the lamp breaking. What we have instead is consequence. For a century, the papacy wandered in the wilderness he entered by violence. Then slowly, he found his road back, chastened, suspicious of grandeur, obsessed with rules, sometimes to a fault, but better armed against the exact combination of vanity and fear that had undone him. The church that emerges in the centuries ahead will be many, many things: triumphant, corrupt, visionary, wrong, but it will never again be as unguarded as it was on the night a pope's throat was cut behind a locked door. That is John's legacy, as well as his accusation. He reminds us that holiness without vigilance is stagecraft, and vigilance without charity is a completely different sort of sin. He asks us to consider that institutions are not saved by saints alone, but by the ordinary courage of men who refuse to flee their posts. He suggests that the keys we lift are the keys we must account for, and that the blood we spill, when we name it in peace or reform or necessity, will one day require an answer. The Lateran has been rebuilt many times since then. The carpets are new, the lamps are all electric now, the guards are professionals. But if you walk the corridors in winter, when the wind carries that dust of centuries and the city is a little too quiet for you to be comfortable, you may hear what Romans have always heard when they allow history to speak plainly. Not a ghost, not a confession, only the stubborn cadence of the thing the scribe wrote in his letter. Yep, endurance, like footfalls in a stone hall. This has been The Keys of Blood, the Assassination of Pope John VIII, an Evio creative miniseries. If you enjoyed the story, follow, rate, and share the show. Your support brings the next series to life. And I invite you to explore the Evio slate of shows: The Devil Within, Criminal Mischief, Taboo Treasures, The Devil's Ledger, and of course, The Ides of April. Visit eviocreative.com and follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod, at The Ides of April Pod, at taboo_treasures, and at Evio Creative. Our work is made possible by sponsors who believe in long-form storytelling. Quince, luxury essentials at honest prices. Go to quince.com/devilwithin for free shipping and 365-day returns. Mint Mobile, premium wireless for $15 a month. Go to mintmobile.com/devilwithin for unlimited talk and text. ExpressVPN, protect your data anywhere. expressvpn.com/devilwithin for up to 4 months free. Mood, legal THC and cannabis gummies delivered nationwide. Mood.com/devilwithin for 20% off your first order. Ollie Dog Food, fresh, human-grade meals. Go to ollie.com/ides for 60% off your welcome kit. And Monarch, take control of your finances. Monarch.com/ides for 50% off your first year. From Evio Creative, I'm Brandon Morgan. Thank you for listening.